Chronicles of the War of Souls Book Series. Book 1 Valeria, The Beginning of the End. Chapter 14. Khazad Gatol. The Call of Ancestors. The great hall of Nar-Uzdum-Arak was fuller than ever, its colossal, vanishing vault swallowing every sound like a bottomless stone womb. But today, that low, polyphonic hum born from hundreds of throats resonated not only in the very stone of the floor, trembling up through the soles of boots. The air, thick and heavy with the reek of burning oil from countless torches, acrid sweat, smoke-cured leather, and ancient, omnipresent dust, rippled from the constant motion of bodies, creating heavy, invisible currents. It seemed the ancient fortress itself, slumbering in silent repose for centuries, was now tense, listening to this clamor heralding change, and every stone, from the polished granite floor to the roughly hewn wall reliefs, held the tension, that anxious vibration of life returned to long-forgotten halls. At the hall's center, around a massive table hewn from a single block of black basalt, sat the elders and chieftains of the assembled clans. On one side, impassive as cliffs polished by eternal winds, were the Dwarves of the Ironhand, led by Dumran, whose heavy, immobile gaze was fixed on empty space, avoiding the traitors of the Copperbeard seated opposite. Torbin Copperbeard, his dense beard smudged with soot, calmly and methodically polished the haft of his engineering hammer. His pragmatic gaze slid over the assembly, assessing not the pomp of rhetoric, but practical gain and inevitable cost. Between them, like a living, breathing wall, sat the gray-bearded dwarves of the Iron Summit, whose elder, the initiator of this grievous gathering, sat with closed eyes, maintaining an air of detached arbitration, yet every word, every sigh uttered in the hall was etched into the deep, dry riverbed-like wrinkles of his face, composing a silent chronicle of the moment, a scroll of flesh and blood where wrath and hope were inscribed with equally indelible ink. Along the hall's perimeter, in the shadow of titanic columns whose summits were lost in the coaling smoke beneath the vaults, stood others whose fates also hung by a thread, a group of humans in tattered garb, and next to them, rangers. Darrell himself, tall and scarred, stood with arms crossed, his vertical, cat-like pupils narrowed to slits, absorbing every detail, every hint of lie or weakness. He caught the slightest shift in tone, or a nervous twitch. For him, a half-breed raised on perilous trails such minutiae, and far more than grand words. Beside them, their immense height and broad shoulders dwarfing even the dwarven guards in polished armor, stood the Centaurs. Vrondar, his face a wine-worn, immobile granite mask, leaned on a long spear. In the depths of his tired, sunken eyes, like embers beneath ash, smoldered the fire of mute fury for burned steps and fallen kin whose bones now whitened. Under a foreign sky, Alina stood slightly behind, her intelligent, cold as winter sky gaze flickered for a moment to the fragile, tense figure of Torian among the humans. Something elusive, akin to silent support, flashed in her eyes, quickly extinguished under the weight of circumstance and the burden of responsibility, heavier than any mail. And finally, the Elves. Lirael and her detachment stood on a low stone dais, specially prepared by the dwarves so their delicate yet resonant voices could be heard, and they themselves seen. They were an island of unearthly, almost unnatural beauty in this brutal, teat, and metal-breathing sea of steel, stone, and muscle. Lirael breathed evenly and deep, preparing for the speech she must deliver, but her inner sight, her sharpened elven sense, was fixed on that very spot in the deep shadow behind a column where, unmoving, stood Braid Stoneheart. His presence was a heavy, tangible weight, pressing not on the ears, on consciousness itself, like the mass of a sleeping mountain whose awakening promised only strife and ruin. The elder of the Iron Summit opened the council. He did not shout, did not strain his aged voice, but his words, low and resonant as the precise strike of hammer on anvil, easily cut through the crowd's hum, silencing even the loudest whispers. He rose, and his shadow, cast by torchlight, fell upon the table, dividing the opposing sides like a dark blade cleaving a stone slab. Children of stone, guests from the greenwoods and boundless steppes, we are gathered here not of our own will, not by the call of our hearts, but by the will of circumstance, grown sharper than any axe blade. He spoke without haste, so each word he uttered would reach every ear present. Listen with your ears, but hear with your hearts. Judge not only deeds, but also intent. On decisions made today beneath these ancient vaults depends whether our descendants see the sun of the future or remain forever in a darkness that will not part until the end of ages. As soon as the elder sank back onto his seat, Dumran Ironhand rose first. His massive frame, encased in dark, battle-scarred steel, seemed the embodiment of the mountain itself. Sheared from its native ridge and given wrathful will, every muscle was taut, every vein on his thick neck pulsed with restrained fury, and his fists resembled war hammers ready to fall upon an enemy. When he spoke, his voice, like the grinding of boulders in a rockslide, filled every corner of the hall, drowning even the crackle of torches. And this voice was not just sound but a physical blow that made innards quake. All anyone speaks of is the storm in the east, he thundered, his words falling like an avalanche. But the storm is already here. It rages in our mountains, in our hearts, while we sit here and indulge in empty talk. Grislik Heartbreaker and his horde mock the bones of our forefathers. In the sacred halls of Khazad Gatol, I demand not words, but steel. Let us unite not for chatter with those who turned their backs on us in times past, but to cast the filth from our ancient stronghold. That is our path. That is our honor. He struck his chestplate with a gauntleted fist, and the metallic clang rolled through the hall like a battle cry that demanded no answer, but demanded blood and action. His speech was met with a dull, thunderous rumble of approval from his clan. Young warriors beat calloused fists against breastplates, and this pounding, like the drumbeat of a colossal stone heart, echoed their chieftain's rage, mirroring their shared, unspoken pain. Torbin Copperbeard, seated opposite, merely smiled, a short, dry sound, a sharp dissonance against the backdrop of common wrath, like a crack on polished granite. He did not rise, remaining seated in his calm, practical pose. His hands, accustomed to the weight of metal and the precision of mechanisms, lay motionless on the table, and this stillness was more eloquent than any gesture. Honor won't feed warriors, Dumran. His voice was even and weighty, like an ingot of fine metal smelted in deep subterranean forges. Nor forge new blades nor mend gates. You propose we mire ourselves in the same war that has dragged on for decades, while the true enemy, of whom all gathered here speak, creeps toward our undefended backs. He looked Dumran square in the eye, as if explaining the sense of his words to him alone. You wish to reclaim a tomb, risking to bury all the living within. Pragmatism, not blind pride, that is what will save our folk from extinction. Torbin's gaze swept over all seated at the table. We must fortify what we have, raise new walls and hoard strength, not weep over what we have lost beyond recall. For the past, however glorious, will not quench thirst nor stop an arrow. The word passed to the representatives of the outer world, and the weight of that word hung in the air, grown thicker still. Ranger Darrell stepped forward, his tall, sparred figure stark against the stocky dwarves like a tree that survived a fire. Almerion is blind, and its blindness is deadly, he said, and each word struck true into the very heart of the fear hiding behind wrath and grievance. The Grand Council of Lords is mired in petty intrigues, dividing power and lands, while in the east gathers an army such as this world has not seen since the elder days. We have seen villages turned to ash, and people turned to flight or led away captive. This threat knows not your borders nor ours. His voice was cold and sharp, devoid of any warmth or hope. You may hide in your deep caves, hoping the storm will pass you by, but it will not pass. It will find every crack, every crevice, and consume all, leaving not even names to be remembered. Then Vrondar spoke. He leaned heavily on his long spear, the shaft bending slightly under his weight, and his voice, deep, band-weary, carried the irrefutable truth of a warrior who had seen death in the eyes of his kin, and the fall of whole villages. My brothers and sisters fell defending human villages, and we Centaurs, children of open spaces and the free wind, have come to your stone halls, a thing we have never done, not out of idle curiosity. He looked at no one in particular, his gaze turned inward, to those scenes that had seared his soul, to the black smoke over burning steppes and the silence after battle. The one called the Iron Shaman is no mere chieftain gathering hordes of those who hate all that lives. He is a poison that taints the very earth, saps its life. He does not wish to conquer it. He wishes it dead, turned to dust. And if we do not stand shoulder to shoulder, next to die will be your mount, and its vaults will become your tomb, and the echo of our quarrels will resound in the void of eternity. It was Lirael's turn. All gazes, heavy, curious, and in some places hostile, fixed upon her. And under this weight of attention the air seemed to congeal. She took a light step forward, and her silvery voice, pure and clear, sounded beneath the ancient vaults like a mournful bell in a sepulchre, disrupting the familiar logic of stone and steel. You speak of honor, of pragmatism, of land, she began, and her words flowed like a quiet stream, finding their way to the very hearts, to those secret places of the soul where instinctive fear of the unknown dwells. But I have come to tell you of the soul of this world, which is gravely ill. The crack upon the white tree of Lindor, which we strive in vain to heal, is but an outward sign of this deep sickness. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering her home, Undorn, the eternal wood. Even before the moment the stars fell from the sky, we came to a call, a desperate, pain-filled summons that came from the very darkness, and we found its source. Not just an army, not just a horde, but a being born of an unfathomable symbiosis of a fallen star and mortal flesh. An ancient, cold, ruthless entity has taken hold of an orc and now seeks his path into this world, to remake it according to its monstrous, incomprehensible will. Her gaze swept the hall, and her eyes, full of bottomless sorrow and unyielding resolve, met dozens of wary, distrustful, yet involuntarily intrigued eyes. She saw her words penetrate the minds of these grim warriors, sowing seeds of unease and understanding, slowly sprouting through the thick armor of prejudice. The Iron Shaman is but a name, a label we gave him, driven by fear or ignorance. His true nature is far more terrible and vast. He is merely a tool, a weapon of a will that seeks to rend the very fabric of creation. And he will not stop. Not before elven forests, nor dwarven strongholds, nor human cities. She paused, letting her gaze sweep the hall again. And why people chose the path of isolation, hoping the affairs of mortals would touch us no more. But I am here to tell you this threat will spare no one. The only thing that can withstand a force that knows neither honor, nor fear, nor pity is unity. Unity of will, unity of purpose. Not an old alliance, broken by grievance and pride, but a new one, born not of friendship, but of stark necessity to survive. A sepulchral, oppressive silence fell in the hall, broken only by the crackle of torches and heavy breathing. Even the air seemed to stop moving, frozen in anticipation. Lirael's words, bolstered by the grim testimonies of humans and centaurs, slowly formed a single, terrifying picture, forcing even the most ardent proponents of isolation and infighting to contemplate the approaching end, that absolute darkness which makes no distinction between clans or peoples. And this fragile, brittle silence, about to crystallize into some decision, was shattered like a ram. Dumran Ironhand struck the stone table with such inhuman force. His steel-gauntleted fist sent a spiderweb of thin, irrevocable cracks snaking across the black basalt surface, and the sound, brief and destructive, was like the snapping of the world string, after which only chaos follows. Enough! His voice, like a subterranean tremor, roared beneath the vaults, filled not only with rage but with deepest contempt for all that did not fit the simple, grim logic of steel and stone. Enough of these children's tales, these phantom fears born in over-refined minds. Cracks in creation, fallen stars seeking vessels of flesh. Do you hear this? While we listen to this madness, Grislik Heartbreaker and his horde mock the bones of our fathers in the halls of Khazad Gatol, fury bold in his eyes with each uttered word, as if ready to spill over into inevitable bloodshed. While we seek alliance with those who betrayed us in times past, the true enemy, an enemy of flesh and blood, whose death can be felt on an axe edge, whose blood can be seen, whose last gasp heard, gathers strength at our very gates. His gaze was now fixed on the tiny figure of Lirael alone, who likewise did not avert her eyes. I demand not words of unity, but steel for vengeance. I demand a march on Khazad Gatol. There is our enemy, tangible, real, and its throat can be slit with our steel blade. All else is but an attempt to distract us from the true goal, to sow the worm of fear in our hearts and make us forget our duty to the dust of our ancestors. Dumran's words again found a furious response among the Ironhand warriors, who raised a loud, rock-slide-like roar of approval. Dwarves in fury beat axe hafts against shields, and this grim battle rhythm echoed the storm in their hearts. But before anyone could object, from the group of humans, frozen in shadow like ghosts, stepped forward a fragile, emaciated figure reduced to its shadow of itself. It was Elodi. Her face, pale and waxen, seemed a death mask, but in her eyes, usually empty and detached like legs frozen by oblivion, burned that same chilling, ruthless fire of prophetic vision that saw not outward forms, but the very essence of the approaching horror, its merciless underside. She took a few steps, barely dragging her feet, and her quiet, lifeless voice was like the rustle of a burial shroud on stone, scarcely audible yet honed like a thin blade, cutting through the din and forcing all, even the most ardent debaters, to fall silent and turn. "You speak of a true enemy," she whispered, and each word, quiet and piercing, hung in the hall, making them shudder from a sudden cold, as if a wind from the kingdom of eternal frost blew from a crack in the floor. "You speak of bones. I saw many bones while caged in the hell that Shaman built. I saw the bones of my little brother, Miko. I saw how his young, pure soul was devoured by a black staff with a crimson, pulsing, living heart crystal, how his lifeless body was torn apart by hungry ogres, and I heard the crunch of his little bones beneath their yellow teeth. The very air seemed to freeze, listening to her, and the torch flames ceased their crackle, consumed by the ensuing silence. I saw the light in his eyes go out, and only emptiness remained, cold and bottomless as a well on a starless night, and that emptiness looked at me, and seeing, unaccusing, simply stating the complete, absolute non-being, she slowly turned to Dumran, and her gaze, full of such pure, concentrated hatred that it seemed a tangible, physical blow, made the grim dwarven chieftain avert his eyes for a moment, feeling on his skin the searing cold of her despair, piercing through steel armor and thick hide. "Your Grizzlick is a pathetic grave robber, desecrating tombs. That he does not desecrate. He annihilates utterly. He does not steal stones nor plunder sepulchres. He snuffs out souls themselves, burns them from the weave of being like a stain with a hot ire." The pause that followed her words filled all space around. No one even stirred, afraid to make a sound. "You prayed to your ancestors, hope their bones find eternal rest in stone coffins. He will not leave them even that hope. He will erase the very memory of them from the world, as one whites dust from a stone. And of your great forebears not even an echo will remain in the subterranean halls. Your war for stones and dust is a child's game in a sandbox, while the real fire consumes the whole house, and soon there will be no sand, no children, no house at all. Your Khazad Gatol is already a crypt, and he will turn the whole world into a silent crypt, from the highest mountains to the deepest seas, and there will be no one left to mourn its passing." She fell silent, catching her breath, her thin, almost childlike shoulders trembling slightly, as if from an inner wind blowing from those dark places she had been, carrying the icy breath of absolute end. After her words, it seemed even the stones of the hall held their breath. Even Dumran, always ready to argue, whose rage was his armor and banner, found no retort. His wrath collided with the icy, immovable bulk of another's, irrefutable suffering, which could no more be denied than the fact of one's own death. The words of this young, wasted girl, steeped in personal tragedy to the core, proved stronger and weightier than any political arguments or clan grievances. They were bitter, lived and endured truth, against which all reasoning was powerless. And that truth hung in the air, like a heavy, invisible shroud. And this ringing, viscous silence, when it seemed the ancient fortress itself was frozen in indecision, was broken by a new voice guttural, with the sing-song accent of the southern wastes, hoarse from the sand and wind that grind down all living things. Forward stepped a lean Khajiit with golden, wild-cat eyes and a face etched with ritual scars telling the silent history of his people. A history no one would continue. "She speaks truth," uttered Mercil, and his voice trembled not from fear but from restraint. Reigned in fury, accumulated over long days, the fury of the last of his line. But her pain, however great and sacred, is but a drop in the sea of common grief flooding the world. My tribe, the desert wind, was destroyed as if it never was. My father, the old chieftain, was sacrificed before my eyes, and his last breath, it was not merely life sent, it was complete, absolute annihilation, disappearance, as if he had never been drawn upon the scroll of being. He continued, lowering his feline gaze to the stone slabs of the dwarven hall. That creature devours not bodies. It devours heritage, traditions, history, songs our mothers sang by cradles. It devours the very memory of a people. Of my people, nothing remains. No song sung by the fire, no names passed from father to son. Only me, the last witness, the last voice holding what none will remember after me. And I tell you, he who destroys us is stronger than your clan grievances, stronger than your stone walls and sturdy gates. He is stronger than death itself, which he has turned into his tool. No sooner had Mercil fallen silent, exhaling his pain which hung in the air, like the heavy echo of forgotten songs, than from the group of humans, powerfully, like a bear roused in its den, stepped forward a grim, his titanic figure, seared by battle fire and scarred like an ancient oak, seemed the very embodiment of the fury that had smoldered in his chest like molten metal in a forge. He did not shout. His thunderous, cavernous voice, born deep in his chest, was more terrible and convincing than any warlike cry. This voice scraped the ears like sandpaper and made innards clench from its primordial power. Words. All speak words, he thundered, turning his massive head, and his furious, burning gaze, like hot coals, slid over Dumran, Torbin, the grey-bearded elders, accusing each of blindness, of stubborn refusal to see the world beyond their fortress walls. You argue, haggle, measure beards like merchants at a village market, while the world burns with blue flame, and the smoke of that fire already creeps to your fortified gates. You wish to see the enemy with your own eyes, yearn to touch him with your hands, feel rough high or cold steel under your fingers. Then look, he roughly, but with desperate, almost fatherly tenderness, shoved forward a pale, trembling youth with an empty, inward gaze fin, with a force that spoke of his own pain and fury. A grim lifted the bow's crudely bandaged, already darkened stump where his right hand had been, thrusting this living, pain-breathing mutilation before the whole assembly like a terrible trophy won not in battle, but in slaughter. See this. His voice broke into a low, rolling roar that made torch flames tremble and metal fastenings on garments ring. On his home, on our shared home, our village of far bank, orcs fell under cover of night, and his hand was gnawed off by a cursed work when he, a simple lad who never held anything sharper than a shepherd's knife, tried to defend a wounded centaur. He was a shepherd. He wanted nothing but to live in peace with his sheep, to hear leaves rustle and river water splash. What more must he do for you to finally understand? What other proof do you need, you stubborn fools? His hand, her brother, his people are these fresh graves now being dug on the world's fringes not enough for you to stop looking at your feet and see the all-consuming fire, already licking your own doorstep with its charred tongue? Among the dwarves, especially the young and hot-blooded warriors of the Iron Hand, rose an outraged, humiliated growl. They felt insulted in the very basis of their being, in their faith in honor and steel. One of them, very young, his face aflame with wrath and eyes full of offense for his chieftain, unable to bear it, cried out in reply, cutting through the rising nose, "And we are to take the word of every wanderer with a tragic tale. Who are these outsiders, to teach us, children of stone, of eternal duty and true honor, forged in darkness and brought into the light?" This proved the last drop, overflowing the cup of patience for those who had kept silent until now. Forward, moving past his kin, smoothly and silently, like a shadow sliding along a wall, stepped the elf Fanner. His hair was disheveled, and in his eyes, usually calm and deep as forest lakes, burned a cold fire of rage. "You call us wanderers?" His voice was low, quiet, and therefore doubly dangerous, like the hiss of sheathed steel before a deadly strike, and this quietness silenced even the young dwarf. "We are Undorn. Our memory is older than your most ancient, moss-covered stones. We remember the birth of the first stars, and you cannot even make peace with your neighbor over an old quarrel that to us is shorter than a blink. You burrow in your dark tunnels like blind moles, and dare call us wanderers, and this at the very moment when to you, to your stone fastness, have come those who have seen the very essence of the approaching end, who have heard creation cracking." He paused briefly, so all would listen, not just the young dwarf. "Our pride, of which you, children of the deeps, know nothing, would not allow us to cross the threshold of this hall, or it merely about your petty squabbles, dividing Orvanes and forgotten halls. We are here because your stubbornness, your blindness, now threatens not only you, but the last refuges of beauty and memory in this world. The crack spreading through the world, it is louder than all your shouts and quarrels, and its rumble drowns even the songs of our forests." The elder of the Iron Summit, who had until now kept a silence akin to the deep calm before a storm, slowly, with effort, as if lifting the weight of all spoken words upon his shoulders, raised his heavy, gray head. He did not rise, but his voice, deep-pent, utterly authoritative, cutting through all other sounds like diamond cuts glass, instantly returned the hall to a tense, precarious silence echoing the last words. "Enough," he pronounced, and that short word, minted in the silence, sounded like a final verdict, brooking no argument, a verdict passed by history itself. "We have heard Dumran's righteous wrath, Torbin's sober wisdom, the deep pain of our guests, brought to our halls as the dearest and bitterest tribute, and now I hear only the barking of young pups biting each other's tails, while a venomous serpent slithers into our common cave to strike all, making no distinction of clan or people. His gaze swept the hull, and his ancient, faded eyes seemed to see through each, reading the most hidden thoughts and fears. All those dark corners of the soul where doubt hides and grievance ripens. Dumran is right in one thing. The enemy, our gates, is real, and it demands steel. But that enemy is not Grizzly Heartbreaker. Torbin is right. We must be pragmatic, can conserve strength. But pragmatism is not to cork ourselves in our hole, hoping trouble will pass by, trusting in the thickness of stone walls. Pragmatism is to understand a simple, hammer-blow truth against the enemy described by these people, Elves and Centaurs. Our axes and stout walls alone will not suffice. The elder pointed a wrinkled finger at a grim, is right in the most crucial thing. We demand proof, blinded by our pride, while stubbornly ignoring the living, breathing proof standing right before us, looking at us with eyes full of pain and mute hope. He leaned heavily on his carved staff, and the ancient, knotted joints of his fingers whitened with strain as he raised his body, clad in simple, and therefore all the more majestic, robes. Each movement carried slow, age-old significance, and it seemed not an old dwarf rose, that the mountain itself gaining voice to pronounce, "Swill." The clan of the Iron Summit has spoken, and its word is henceforth carved in stone, he thundered, and his voice seemed to absorb the hall's entire hun, and turn it into reverent silence. We cannot, have no right to fight on two fronts against the ghosts of the past whispering from graves, and the living nightmare of the future approaching our gates. Daring the silence of complete non-being, we choose the future, for without it the past becomes but a collection of headstones with no one to tend them. We acknowledge the threat called the Iron Shaman, as common to all children of this world, from the loftiest elf to the deepest dwarf, and we will act according to our duty and our honor, which commands us to defend life, not just stones. He looked directly at Dumran, and in his ancient, faded gaze was no challenge or reproach, only the genuine, stone-heavy weight of an inevitable decision may, after long and agonizing deliberation, a weight all must now share. Runners already carry word through all tunnels and mountain echoes of the Dragon's Back. A great council of all clans, from the copper gorges to the granite peaks, will be convened here, in the halls of Nar-Uzdum-Arak, to hear these testimonies steeped in pain and truth, and to make a single decision. As our forefathers did in the darkest times, the Iron Hand may take part, bringing its wrath and its steel to the common treasury, or stand aside, stewing in its grievance like soured ale. His words sounded like a sentence for all gathered in that hall, especially those seated at the stone table. But know this, and carve these words in memory. Those who stand aside will stand utterly alone before the coming storm, and the stone that remembers all will not preserve the names of those who willingly chose the path of oblivion, turning from their kin in the hour of greatest need. The heavy, dense silence following the speeches of a grim, merciful, and the elder suddenly gained weight and direction, like an invisible river flowing deep into the hull, drawing all gazes and anxious thoughts. It coalesced at the hall's far end, by a titanic granite column whose summit was lost in the smoky gloom beneath the vaults. And from there, from the very heart of that silence, a voice finally sounded, the voice of Braid Stoneheart. It was not loud, yet filled all space like an underground rumble felt not with ears, but with bones low, vibrating, and implacable. He took a few slow, measured steps forward, emerging from shadow into the wavering torchlight, and with each step the air seemed to thicken, growing denser. His cloak, coarse and smelling of the dust of deepest, forgotten caverns and the chill of subterranean lakes, seemed heavier than lead, its folds lying motionless as if carved from stone. He looked neither at Dumran blazing with fury nor at Torbin frowning in thought. His bottomless, dark gaze was turned upon all gathered, yet he seemed to see not their faces, but something far beyond the stone walls of the fortress, beyond the mountains, in the very heart of the approaching darkness, that very void that devours light and memory. All you have said here is truth. His voice was low and deep, like the echo of a distant collapse in the farthest, abandoned mines where no living foot has trod for ages. It held none of Dumran's rage nor Torbin's dry pragmatism, only cold, implacable statement of fact, broken no doubt, like the law of gravity. The army gathering in the east is real, and its breath already sears the steppes, burning grass and turning encampments to ash. And the force that leads it strives not for simple conquest, more enslavement, but for complete, total oblivion. Oblivion of all things, the nose of forests, the whisper of steps, the memory of ancestors held in your stones, and the eternity of stone itself, which will be ground to dust, stripped of its history. He fell silent a moment, letting his words, heavy as boulders, settle in the consciousness of each listener, penetrate the deepest recesses of mind, and make them shudder with realization of the threat scale. You, Dumran, speak of honor, of duty to the bones of ancestors. You, Torbin, of survival of the living, of daily bright and stout gates, but you argue, staring at the ground, examining a crack by your own threshold, and do not see, do not feel that your whole house, your very creation, is about to crumble under external pressure. And then there will be neither honor, nor bread, nor gates. That is not merely an enemy, not another orc chieftain whose head can be mounted on a pike. It is an axe already raised above the world's neck, and to its black, soot dark banners flock all who hate the very breath of life, the very memory that preserves this world from decay and chaos. Braid slowly, almost mechanically turned his head, and his gaze, heavy and inexorable as a glacier's movement, finally met Dumran's burning, furious stare, and it seemed those two gazes, colliding, struck invisible sparks in the air. You are right in one thing. The enemy is already here. Not only there, far in the east, beyond ridges and valleys. It is within our own walls, in our very flesh, like a splinter festering a wound from within. Those who have holed up in Khazad Gatol, desecrating your sanctities, I do not doubt that when the shaman reaches the very foot of these mountains, they will joyously and gleefully unbar the passages for him and join his hordes. As a rotten finger joys a hand already beyond saving, they have already become part of that darkness that seeks to grind memory to dust, leaving no trace, no name, no recollection. An alarmed, frightened whisper raced through the hall, swift and cold as a snake. The Braid unhurriedly raised a hand clad in a simple steel gauntlet, and the whisper instantly died, suppressed not by volume but by the inexplicable, absolute gravity of that gesture. The gesture of a commander accustomed to being heated. We will be caught between the shaman's axe from the east and the chopping block of goblins from the north. Burning bridges behind you is the first and foremost rule of tactics studied even by green recruits. While that abscess, that festering, stinking wound sits at our backs, we cannot give a proper rebuff to the main threat. We will be forced to fight on two fronts, diverting forces, splitting our already meager hosts, and we will simply be crushed, as a hammer crushes nuts, not given a moment for a final prayer. He swept the hall with his piercing gaze, and in his eyes, devoid of any ordinary dwarven fire, was read not simple conviction, but something else. More ancient and frightening knowledge carved on the tablets of fate itself, accessible only to those who see the essence of things, who have witnessed not only life being born and dying, but whole eras. And this knowledge spoke of one thing, the inevitability of the choice to be made here and now, in the wavering torchlight, beneath the heavy vaults of the ancient hall. Therefore I say, yes, the threat in the east is paramount, and it cannot be ignored by closing your fortress heavy gates, but the path to its destruction, to its repulsion, lies through cleansing your own lands, through reclaiming what was lost by your own folly and pride. First, Khazad Gatol, we must burn this infection with hot iron, before it merges with the main plague, before poison from the abscess taints the whole body's blood. Restore your ancient stronghold, so it may again be a shield, a bulwark, not a poisoned dagger in the back ready to treacherously strike at the decisive moment. And only with our rear secured, all clans united under one battle banner before the common, mortal enemy, can we meet the storm from the east, not as cornered rats, but as dwarves standing on their own land, defending their home, their hearth, and the memory of their ancestors. First eradicate what is already here, at our side, whispering from the darkness of our own caves, then face what comes from without, from the boundless plains. There is simply no other path for us, and he who does not see this is already half dead. And then his gaze, cold and inexorable as the movement of tectonic plates, slowly turned and met Lirael's intent, studying stare. She had not averted her elven eyes, the color of spring foliage, all this time, feeling a strange, tortuous, and inexplicable connection with this being in dwarven guise, a connection stretching like a finest yet unbreakable web across the hall, through all the noise and fury. In the depths of his bottomless, deepest mine eyes was nothing of Dumran's fiery rage nor Torbin's calculating coldness, nor any shadow of that animal, human pain that had spoken through Elodi's lips. There was only immeasurable, all-comprehending, and therefore terrifying to numbness knowledge, from which blood froze in veins and soul grew numb, knowledge of things not meant for mortals. You heard the call, uttered Braid, and his word sounded not as a question, but as statement of an accomplished, irrefutable fact he saw as clearly as runes on his axe. His voice was for her alone, cutting through the hall's thick hum as if it were not there, reaching only her ears, each syllable ringing pure and cold in her consciousness. Your call was a weak echo of mine. I called for one who could not only hear, but understand, penetrate the very essence of what approaches us. You possess the true gift of sight, and you even now, this very moment, begin to comprehend who I truly am, and what force compelled me to break silence. His gaze seemed to penetrate Lirael's very soul, seeing not only her fear and resolve, but also the gaping, deafening void left in her after the suddenly severed call, the very one that had led her here, to these stone halls full of wrath and despair. You hear it no longer, because that part of your path is complete. You fulfilled your role, led your kin to the needed threshold, to the place where fate is decided not only for our peoples, but for the world itself. My path, it only begins here, in this hall, amidst these quarrels and this fury. And on this path, his voice regained that metallic, all-shattering firmness that made one believe every word as one believes in granite strength. We need not only dwarven axes and stout armor, but the light of elven memory to remember what exactly we defend from oblivion, what light we may lose forever. His gaze fell on a grim, then on Vrondar, and the fury of men, to burn the filth to ash, leaving no cinder, and the arrows of centaurs, to prevent the darkness from surrounding us on all sides, so the wind of freedom may blow at our backs. He turned again to the elder's table, his figure seeming to absorb all the hall's attention, but his final words, quiet and incredibly weighty, were addressed solely to Lirael, and only she, with her sharpened elven hearing, could discern them, and they pierced her consciousness like icy needles. Soon you will understand that the true trial for your people, for your faith and your duty, begins not in the green depths of Undorn, but here, in these stone halls, where the only question is decided whether the world shall be at all or sink into non-being, and on your choice depends whether your descendants will see dawn or only eternal, unbroken night. After these words, a thunderous silence reigned in the great hall. It was thick, heavy, filled with the hum of thousands of unspoken thoughts, fears, and nascent decisions. It seemed even the eternal torch flames froze, and the titanic vault ceased reflecting echo, absorbing the entire sound wave fan, leaving only oppressive, almost tangible silence which beat the hearts of hundreds gathered. Each in the hall pondered what they had heard, and the picture, assembled from fragmented pieces, finally acquired a frightening, crystalline clarity. Dumran, whose fury was aimed at the tangible enemy in Khazad Gatol, now saw it not as an end goal, but as an obstacle on the path to saving the entire people, as the first step to a great battle, not its finale. His stubbornness clashed with the iron, implacable logic of a strategist who saw the entire battlefield, from the farthest approaches to the heart of the mountain kingdom. Torbin Copperbeard, whose pragmatism dictated conserving strength and fortifying what they had, now understood there was no pragmatism in letting a wound fester at their back, poisoning the whole body. Defending the fortress was meaningless if its very foundation yawned with a crack, leading straight to the enemy's camp. The elder of the iron summit slowly nodded, his gray beard swaying like mountain moss in the wind. His gaze, fixed on Braid, was free of former wariness, and it was red-heavy, hard-won acknowledgement and bitter resolve. The solution, it seemed, lay on the surface, and Braid Stoneheart had merely pointed it out, arranging everything in its place like an experienced engineer assembling a complex structure. One could not march toward doom leaving a knife in one's back. One could not save the future without securing the past, without reclaiming what was lost. The path was one: unite, burn the filth from Khazad Gatol, restoring to the dwarves their heart and their rear, and only then, a single unbreakable rock, meet the main storm gathering in the east, bearing on its banners complete and final oblivion. This was the silence that follows the strike of hammer on anvil, not emptiness, but a thick, meaning-filled hum in which every uttered word, every sigh and every heartbeat resonated. The air grew heavy as molten metal, hard to breathe, and each inhalation seared lungs with awareness of the inevitable choice already made, yet still unspoken. The dust of ages, stirred up in furious argument, now slowly settled, and through it emerged the contours of fate, joyless and clear as the outline of an axe on a scaffold, ready to fall upon the condemned world's neck. And in this ringing silence, saturated with meaning and tension like the final chord before a great battle, sounded the voice of the Elder of the Iron Summit. It did not thunder like Dumran's, shaking the vaults, nor was it honed like Torbin's cold steel. It resembled the grinding of an ancient but still functioning mechanism that for centuries had turned the millstones of history, and now set in motion something far more vast. "Stone does not lie," he pronounced, and his words, slow and weighty, seemed to carve runes right in the air, leaving an invisible trace in each listener's memory. "And it shows us the only crack that threatens to bring down all we know. Not where we argue of honor and gain, but where we must be united as a monolith. Braid Stoneheart speaks truth, endured in the darkest, forgotten caverns of the world, where torchlight does not reach. We cannot march to meet the storm, leaving an open door for a treacherous knife at our backs." His gaze swept the hall, and his old, faded eyes, like time-polished sapphires, seemed to see not only the gathered dwarves, elves, and humans here, but the uncounted thousands awaiting their decision in the shaded halls of elven cities, and on the windy plateaus of settlements, all whose fate hung by this thin, gossamer thread. "The clan of the Iron Summit joins the march on Khazad Gatol," he proclaimed, and his voice acquired that ritual might that moves mountains, and diverts the courses of underground rivers, not as vassal nor as leader, but as brother in arms, ready to share bread, and blood, and common fate. "We shall forge this alliance in the fire of shared battle, to then turn the blade tempered in combat against the true enemy that creeps from the east." The decision was made. It hung in the air, tangible and inexorable as a sentence carved on a stone slab, and strange to say its weight was not oppressive, but rather liberating, lifting the burden of agonizing doubt, doubts that had gnawed at souls for hours retreated at once, yielding to cold, honed, axe-blade resolve. Even Dumran argued no more. He stood, clenching his mighty, scarred fists, his steel-clad chest heaving heavily, but in his eyes, usually filled only with blind rage, now burned a new, strategic fire. He saw the path, hard, bloody, strewn with bones, but the only true one. And then other voices sounded not loud, but firm as flint, the voices of men whose homes had already been erased by the approaching darkness, the voice of a centaur, for whom honor was no empty word but the law of the steppe written by the hooves of ancestors. And finally, pure as a mountain stream, the voice of Lirael, sounding with that piercing clarity possessed only by those who have already looked into the abyss, and not retreated, preserving within a particle of light. She did not make grand speeches. She simply said, looking at Braid, whose silent presence in that moment was more eloquent than any oath, "Undorn will fight shoulder to shoulder with the children of stone, not for old friendship long crumbled in history's archives, for a future that must not become a single, starless night where there is no place for songs or memory." And in these simple, unpretentious words lay all the terrible truth of their position. They went to die not for glory, not for wealth, nor even for honor understood as vainglory. They went to die for the simplest, most important thing, for the right of that future to simply arrive, for the possibility of a new day for those who might never know their names. Lirael, standing on her days, felt her own anxiety, which had nested in her chest, replaced by a strange, almost unnatural calm. The inner void left by the silence call now filled with something else, not a voice, but a feeling, deep and irrefutable, a feeling of the rightness of the chosen path, however terrible and fatal it might be. She looked at Braid, and it seemed she now began to understand the nature of his silence. He bore within him not merely knowledge of the threat, but the very weight of what was to come, a weight comparable to the pressure of a whole mountain range on fragile shoulders. And he had nothing to share but this knowledge, without embellishment, without sweet hope, only with bare, steel necessity to act. The council dispersed as slowly as it had gathered, with dignity and a heavy, stone deliberate pace of its main participants. Runners already raced through dark tunnels with news of the great and unthinkable alliance, that the main decision had been made here, in the central hall, and now each clan, each present, had to digest it, try it on like armor to be worn for long, bloody months, feeling its weight on their shoulders. Lirael found Braid where she expected, at the hall's far end, by that same titanic granite column where he had stood from the beginning, as if an integral part of it. He took no part in the general bustle, issued no rapid orders. He simply gazed into the emptiness before him, but his gaze was so heavy and saturated with hidden meaning, it seemed it could press through the stone floor. The air around him was different, thick, stifling, smelling of cooled lava and ancient, untouched strata lying deeper than the deepest dwarven mines, where time flows differently. She approached soundlessly, as befitted an elf, her feet making no sound on polished stone. But he, without turning his head, spoke, and his voice sounded like a continuation of the thoughts hanging in the air. "You have come for answers." His voice was low, deep, like the echo of a collapse in the farthest, abandoned mines. But it held no usual dwarven hoarseness, only even, indifferent power, akin to the hum of the earth itself, heard not with ears, but with one's whole being. "You said my call was an echo of yours," she began, stopping a step from him, feeling the cold emanating from him, "that our meeting is not chance, but predetermined by something greater. I wish to understand, who are you? What are you, truly?" Braid Stoneheart. Braid slowly, almost mechanically turned his head toward her. His eyes, dark and bottomless as the deepest shafts of Khazad, met her gaze. In them was neither anger nor irritation at her persistence, only bottomless, all-comprehending knowledge from which blood froze in veins and will grew numb. Knowledge of things lying beyond ordinary understanding. Names uttered the being with Braid's voice, and in its intonation, usually firm and immovable, echoed infinite, cosmic weariness, a weariness lasting longer than the life of whole civilizations, longer than mountains have existed. They mean nothing to such as I. They are but labels you mortals hang upon what you cannot comprehend in your short span. As a child names an unfamiliar stone, unknowing of its ancient history. He paused, and the air round them thickened, grew heavy as lead and cold as from the depth of permafrost. Even the noise from the hall's far end seemed muffled and distant, as if from another world. But in your annals, in the most ancient scrolls that hold memory of the world's birth, of the first breath of wind and the cooling of molten rock, I was called Gia. Lirael felt her breath catch, her heart freezing for a moment in her chest. That name resonated in her with a dull, alarm bell echo, as if a huge bell had struck a top string of her own memory, awakening knowledge slumbering in the depths of elven consciousness. She remembered fused plates of dark, maga-like glimmering mica in Lundorn's great library, remembered script pressed upon its rough, eternal surface, of the 12 Star Wardens, the powers that stood at the beginning of all things. "A warden," she whispered, and her voice, usually resonant and firm, trembled, betraying the shock constricting her throat. "You are one of the ancients, the one who bound the shifting dust of creation, gave form to chaos, and raised the world's first bastions to being." In Braid's guise, slowly, with inhuman smoothness, nodded, and in that movement was the weight of whole geological epochs. In his eyes, deep as the most abandoned mines where no dwarf's foot had ever trod, surged immeasurable, inconceivable to mortal minds, age-old sorrow, sorrow for what was, and for what inevitably must happen. "The one you call the Iron Shaman, his true name is Animus," it continued, and its voice acquired metallic, cold hardness, like steel tempered in cosmic vacuum, "is my brother, he who should have kept the balance and flow of life with me, but desired to subjugate all being, become sole ruler over creation. He gathers souls, the very sparks of being, devours memory and will, so that one day, having amassed sufficient strength to cast down the god-creators themselves from their heavenly thrones and take their place." Lirael looked at him, and everything suddenly, with terrifying and irrefutable clarity, fell into place, forming a single, monstrous picture, to crack upon the white tree, from which seeped her world's life force, to falling stars her forebears had witnessed. All these were not disparate disasters, but symptoms of one and the same, the collapse of creation itself, cracking from within from fratricidal war between those who should have guarded and preserved it. "And Braid?" she asked softly, almost soundlessly, afraid to hear the answer yet unable to avoid it. "The true Braid Stoneheart, his will was stronger than the purest adamant, born in the core of dying stars," came the answer, even and devoid of human emotion. Like reading text from a stone book, he agreed to become a vessel, a temporary abode, so that I, whose true form cannot exist in your reality, might aid your perishing world. His personality, his memories, his fury and his honor are now part of me, as I am part of him. This was predestined in the book of being, far earlier than this world was born, and long before the first dwarf hewed the first path in the mountain's depths." Lirael was silent, trying to grasp the monstrous, overwhelming scale of what was happening. They, mortals, dwarves, elves, humans, were but pawns on a giant chessboard, or, at best, soldiers in a war that began long before their birth and might end only after their death, if it would ever end. "Why have you told this to me?" she finally exhaled, and in her voice was not only anxiety, but the heavy burden of newly acquired knowledge. Why not to the elders? Not to the kings of men, because your people remember, Giam said simply, without hint of flattery. Your memory, held in the songs of trees and the light of moonstones, is almost as ancient as this mountain. And to prevail, to stand against my brother, we need not merely weapons of steel or spells from ancient tomes. We need understanding, deep, unshakable understanding of what we truly defend, for what we spill blood. Not merely land or stones, but the very soul of this world, its history, written in every stream and upon every leaf, its memory, which is the only shield against the non-being animus brings. He turned, and his movements lacked the usual dwarven heaviness. They were slow, unhurried, weighty as the movement of tectonic plates, and he moved away. Deep into the hall where shadows lay thick and impenetrable, his silhouette began to dissolve in them, but his final words, quiet and incredibly weighty, hung in the cold air, etching into consciousness. Prepare your kin, daughter of the forest. Soon we march on Khazad Gatol, and that will be but the first, the least battle in a war that will decide the fate of all being, and its outcome will depend on how firmly you can hold to that which makes your world alive. Lirael remained standing alone in the deepening silence of the almost empty hall, and felt the heavy, soul-chilling knowledge fill her, displacing former fears and doubts, replacing them with vast, crushing responsibility. She looked at a thin, almost invisible crack in the stone masonry, a tiny flaw in the dwarves' majestic creation, and now saw in it a direct, frightening reflection of that great crack that had run through the very heart of creation, threatening to tear it apart. Lirael left the great hall, feeling the weight of what she had heard as if an unseen mountain range had settled upon her fragile shoulders, pressing with every stone. The air in the common quarters, where she headed, was thick and seared, the lungs saturated with the smell of unwashed sweat, smoke-cured leather, acrid pitch-torch smoke, and all-pervasive anxiety hanging like mist. Her elves, Daryl's men, and Vronder's centaurs had settled in a far corner of a vast cave turned into a temporary camp, and a muffled hum of voices, full of doubt, weariness, and restrained anger, met her at the entrance, breaking into her consciousness already overflowing with new knowledge. Rushing into the first scrap the dwarves have cooked up under the mountain, one of the young rangers was heatedly saying, twisting his smooth ashwood bow in his hands, while the real enemy, he warned about, calmly gathers strength in the east, and sharpens its teeth for us, and wits left for us. Whelp, Gart growled in reply, sitting on a rough stone and leaning on his heavy, notched axe. Sit here in this stone trap and wait for him to come visiting. Without the dwarves' strongholds, without these walls, were easy prey for any horde on open ground. Alina, examining Finn's bandaged stump, listened silently. Her intelligent, all-seeing eyes slid over the entering Lirael, and in them flashed a mute expectation, a demand for clarity. Vrondar, leaning on his long spear, stood slightly apart, his granite, wine-worn face an impassive mask, but the tension in his thick, powerful neck muscles betrayed the fierce inner struggle between honor and pragmatism. Lirael walked into the circle's center, and her appearance, suddenly filled with resolve, silenced the arguers as if a wind had blown out all candles at once. All gazes questioning, wary, full of vague hope for clarity and guidance fixed upon her. Upon her pale, inner light-illumined face, the decision was not made lightly, and it is dictated not by blind fury. She began, and her voice, pure and clear as a mountain spring, cut through the tense, stifling atmosphere. And this is no dwarven scrap, as some think. What is happening now in Khazad Gatol, and what rises in the east are two sides of the same coin. Two tightly bound threads in a single weave, and if you pull one, the other strains. Her gaze swept over those gathered, seeing in their eyes the same incomprehension, the same narrowness of view that had tormented her just an hour ago, before the conversation that overturned all her perception. I spoke with Braid Stoneheart, she continued. A complete, sepulchral silence fell in the hall, broken only by the crackle of torches. But it is no longer Braid, not entirely, not only him. That which now speaks with his mouth and looks upon us with his eyes is something infinitely ancient, older than the oldest oaks of our forests, older than these mountains that seem eternal, older than the very memory of our peoples combined. She paused, letting them prepare for the blow that was to shatter the familiar picture of the world. He is one of the 12 spirit wardens, pillars, created at the beginning of time to bind the shifting creation, give it form and law. In our most ancient annals, kept in Lindorn, he is called Giam. Star of earth, he whose will turn primordial dust into the firmament upon which we stand. An astonished, muffled whisper raced through the ranks, like the rustle of dry leaves before a storm. Even the most cynical and seasoned of Daryl's rangers looked at her with wide eyes in which confusion and disbelief mixed with superstitious fear. And the one in the east, Lirael's voice grew firmer, steel notes sounding in it, is his brother. He too is of the 12, a fallen warden. He who should have preserved balance, but desired absolute power over all being. He gathers souls, sucks out the primordial energy of being, so that one day, having amassed strength, to challenge the god-creators themselves and take their place. So this war, Daryl spoke slowly, with difficulty choosing words, his voice hoarse from long silence and inner tension, is not our war. We're just pawns in a game of gods. Toes in their dispute? No. Lirael cut in sharply, almost fiercely. Her eyes, usually calm, flashed with green fire. This is our war more than anyone's, because the stake is our very existence. Our souls are fuel for his army, kindling for his pyre. Our memory, our forests, our cities, all he hates and seeks to grind to dust. All that makes us alive. The goblins in Khazad Gatol are merely the first of those who have already joined him, or will join as soon as he draws nearer. If we do not forge this alliance now, if we do not wrest this foothold from under him, we will be caught between hammer and anvil, between the main horde from the east and goblins striking our backs, in our very rear. She caught her breath, her chest heaving heavily, a ringing in her ears from her own vehemence. Braid sacrificed himself, his personality, his freedom, to give us a chance, so that an ancient power, faithful to the primal order, could fight on our side, not watch our demise from afar. He does not ask us to die for dwarven squabbles or their shiny stones. He leads us to battle for the very soul of this world, for the right of the future to arrive at all, for the morning dawn to rise over the world, not over ash. The silence that followed her words was different, not bewildered or angry, but deep, heavy, contemplative, as if each was gnawing at the essence of what was said, fitting it to his own life and fate. A Grim slowly nodded with understanding, his titanic, scarred figure seeming slightly less hunched under the burden of care. So it's not about stones, he rasped, and his voice sounded like the grinding of stones, nor about avenging old grievances, but about not letting this plague spread further and devour all that still lives. Exactly so, Lirael firmly confirmed. Khazad Gatol is not the goal. It is the first line of defense we cannot yield, a foothold we cannot leave in enemy hands, or the next battle we will have to fight at the walls of this refuge, which will become our trap. Vrondar leaned heavily on his spear and straightened to his full immense height, his shadow falling over those seated, and in his tired, sunken eyes kindled the familiar fire of resolve. The step teaches a simple truth. When you see a venomous serpent at the very threshold of your tent, you do not wait for it to slither inside and bite your children. You cut off its head without delay. That head now lies in the Dwarves' mountain. His weary but firm gaze swept over the gathered, lingering briefly on Alina and Chiron. I and my kin will go into that stone confine, not for dwarves and their treasures, so that our foals may yet have land to run free upon, so the wind may yet rustle in the feather grass, not howl over scorched wasteland. One by one, nodding or silently meeting her gaze, the men, elves, and centaurs gave their assent, and in their eyes was read not blind faith, but grim resolve. Doubts had not vanished completely. Those gathered were too experienced and sensible for that. The personal grievances and fear now yielded to something stronger, cold, joyless, yet crystal clear understanding of necessity, the only right path in the gathering darkness. Lirael looked at them, at this fragile, newborn brotherhood forged in the crucible of common despair, and felt the monstrous weight on her shoulders shift slightly, distributing among many, turning from a burden into shared responsibility. The path was clear as never before, and it led into the very heart of the dwarven realm, to the ancient stronghold that from a bastion of forefathers had become a den of filth. The first battle of the great, incomprehensible war approached inexorably, and its breath already chilled their faces, while runners carried word to all far corners of the dragon's back. Within the stone bowels of Nar-Uzdum-Arak workseat, the decision, hard won in argument, now had to be forged into steel, flesh, and tactical maps. The fortress atmosphere shifted from heavy, indecisive stagnation to focused, businesslike bustle, pierced by the clang of metal and clipped commands. The great forge halls, where for centuries the continent's finest weapons had been born, now hummed like disturbed hives, filling the underworld with a deafening symphony of labor. Dozens of forges blazed with infernal flame, casting dancing shadows of mighty figures moving in the heat haze upon soot-blackened walls. The air was thick and seared the lungs, saturated with the smell of red-hot metal, acrid coal smoke, and sour, pungent sweat. The ringing of heavy hammers striking anvils with clockwork precision merged into a single, continuous, almost rhythmic roar. The grim battle hymn of the dwarven folk, knowing but one refrain: forge. Weaponsmiths of the Iron Hand, setting aside clan prejudice, worked side by side with masters of the Copperbeards, whose precise and cunning devices, crossbows with geared cranks, shields with steel springs, complemented the simple crushing power of axes and halberds. They repaired, tempered, and improved not only dwarven weaponry, but also the elegant blades of rangers, the light arrowheads of elves, and the massive spearheads of centaurs. Every blade that now left the hammer was not just iron, it was a tangible symbol of the new, fragile alliance, bound not by friendship but by common calamity. Lirael and her detachment did not remain aloof from this universal movement. The elves, whose skill with the longbow was unmatched, spent long hours in a spacious archery range set up in one of the high, drafty halls. Their unhurried, automatic polished movements, quiet commands in the melodious elven tongue, the hiss of bowstrings all formed a stark contrast to the thunderous dwarven bustle, yet was no less effective and deadly. Iviel, combining her ancient knowledge with the practical skills of dwarven healers familiar with subterra, nine poisons and diseases, prepared salves and bandages. The scents of healing mountain herbs mingled with the pungent reek of dwarven sulfur and alcohol-based antiseptics, creating a strange but reassuring aroma of readiness for future wounds. Daryl's rangers and Vrondar centaurs, in turn, became the living, connective bridge between the different, ill-matched parts of the allied army. The half-breeds, accustomed to operating alone or in small, mobile groups, now spent hours studying dwarven tunnel maps spread on tables, delving into the complex, web-like network of passages, mechanical traps, and hidden doors enveloping Khazad Gatol. Daryl, with his cold, predatory insight, sat in the staff cavern with Torbin Copperbeard and gray-bearded strategists of the Iron Summit, making precise and merciless adjustments to assault plans. They won't await a frontal assault at the main gates, he said, tracing a long, scarred finger over the three-dimensional map carved on a stone slab. Grizzlick is a coward, but cunning as a rat. Hellhole up deep inside, where his numbers will have decisive advantage in close quarters. And those kobold miners, they'll come not from the front, but from the lowest, flooded levels, from under the very stone. We need stout barriers at all ventilation shafts and emergency passages you spoke out. The centaurs, chafing and feeling imprisoned in stone walls, took upon themselves the role of trainers. Their powerful, muscular bodies and fierce, furious fighting style, honed in countless step raids, became a stark and harsh lesson for dwarven warriors accustomed to tight formations and shattering blows. In one of the most spacious halls, Vrondar and Alina demonstrated how to meet an enemy without letting it break the line, using the length of spears. All this time, Braidgium remained aloof from direct preparation, like a silent mountain. He appeared only rarely, emerging as if from the very shadow of stone walls to ask a single, precise question or make a laconic, broking no argument amendment to the plan, which later, to the commander's astonishment, proved key and salvific. His presence was heavy, tangible, as if the ancient mountain itself watched their preparations. Keeping silence, he did not command, demanded no obedience. His authority was a given, as irrefutable as the law of gravity making a stone fall. Days passed, filled with toil and tense expectation. The mood in the fortress was dual, like two faces of one coin. On one side growing, work-stoked confidence in their own strength and the spirit of camaraderie born in shared labor, breaking old barriers. On the other a burdensome, oppressive dread of the unknown. All understood, the true test would begin only when messengers from the other clans arrived. Would they accept this mad decision to leave age-old strife and unite under command of one, in whom an ancient spirit spoke, to storm a stronghold soaked in dwarven blood? Or would the great council turn into a new, even fiercer and bloodier brawl, daring the last faint chance for unity before the end? This expectation hung in the air, like the smell of a storm before lightning strikes, thick and anxious. Each hammer blow on metal, each twine of a drawn bowstring, each scrape of whetstone on steel was not merely preparation, it was a challenge thrown into the abyss of the future. a challenge on the answer to which depended whether Nar-Uzdum-Arak would become the birthplace of a new legend or its final funerary hall where the last hope would die. And then the first tidings came, not with a weary runner breaking through the pauses, but with a dull, swelling, deep resonating hum that crawled along the most ancient, resonant like strings tunnels leading to the fortress. It was not just sound, it was a physical sensation akin to the approach of a distant, but powerful subterranean tremor, when not only the air, but the very stone underfoot vibrates. The air in the forge halls wavered, and for a moment even the deafening, accustomed roar of hammers was drowned, absorbed by this low-frequency hum coming from the mountain's very depths. From its slumbering heart, work ceased of its own accord. Dwarves, elves, humans all raised their heads as one, freezing in unnatural poses, listening to this hum, absorbing it with every cell. It was the sound of a march, not of 100, not 1,000, but many thousands of dwarves moving in unison, in grim, implacable rhythm. The sound of countless souls grinding on rough stone mingled with the dull, massive clang of armor rattling in time. It was the hum of an approaching storm, but a storm coming not from without, not from the skies, but from the deepest, forgotten caverns of their own world, bringing either salvation or final sentence. The scouts appeared first, pouring from different tunnels like disturbed ants from their underground passages. Their figures, coated in the gray dust of far roads and frozen grime, emerged from a side tunnel and, without slowing their long dwarven stride, headed toward the cluster of elders standing by the black basalt table. One, his face wine-worn and mustache thick with road dust, reported hoarsely, and his voice cut the tense silence. Clan Thunderhammers from the north, led by Borin Deep Throat, marching with full war circle, with baggage and siege engines. Before those present could properly digest this news, from another, narrower passage leading from highland plateaus came a different sound, not the thunder of thousands of feet, but a measured, solemn, and cold ringing, as if someone carried hundreds of thin, mirror-polished steel plates etched with runes that chimed with each step, as if tuning to an unseen magical frequency, creating an eerie, unearthly music. And behind them the rune wardens from the peak of eternal snows. The second scout pronounced crisply, and his voice held genuine respect mixed with fear, led by Magni's stonecutter himself. And then, as if from the very shadow of the third, darkest and dampest tunnel leading from unexplored depths, a third figure emerged noiselessly, like a ghost. Its armor was matte black, absorbing torchlight, and its face was hidden by a full helm adorned with stylized, sharp bat wings. And the watchers, in the dark from the bottomless caverns, uttered the scout, and in his usually firm voice sounded for the first time genuine, soul-chilling alarm, led by Helga Absol herself. No one saw from where they came. The names, reaching those gathered, sounded like heavy, charred hammer blows on an anvil, resonating in each consciousness. Thunderhammer's fierce, fearless berserkers whose avalanche charge was crushing as the elements themselves. Rune wardens cold, detached masters of battle magic and steel enchantment, whose spells carved on armor and weapons could shatter not only flesh but immortal spirit. And the most enigmatic, almost mythic watchers in the dark, about whom only vague, fragmentary rumors circulated, that they guarded in lightless depths something before which even the goblin threat paled, and seemed childish mischief. The great hall of Nar-Uzdum-Arak began to slowly but inexorably fill, like a cup being poured from different vessels. First came small but representative clan groups, elders, war leaders, their squires. They entered with emphasized, grim dignity, surveying those gathered searchingly, with unconcealed distrust, and at times with open, age-old enmity readable in every glance. The air in the hall grew thicker and heavier, saturating with the smell of far-brought mountain dust, cold, sun-and-touched stone, foreign, sharp sweat, and old, mountain-aged animosity hanging between clans for centuries. Lirael, watching from a high gallery, felt the physical tension rise with each new entering group. With each new glance full of suspicion, she saw Dumran Ironhand clench his mighty, scarred fists at the sight of thunder-hammered warriors, with whom his clan had long, bloody accounts over rich veins in the living ridge. She saw Torbin Copperbeard skeptically frown, and shake his head at the appearance of the rune wardens, whose refined magic always seemed to him an impractical and unreliable waste of time and effort. And then, parting the crowd, entered they themselves, the chieftains. Borin Deep Throat, whose famous plate armor, patinated by time, was etched with fresh notches and deep dents, his gray, intricately braided beard tightly bound by massive bands of black volcanic glass. Magni's stonecutter, incredibly tall and lean for a dwarf, more like a statue, his face tattooed with runes that glowed faintly in the half-light with shimmering azure light. His long, almost elven fingers with perfectly trimmed nails nervously shuffled bone tokens, carved with ancient symbols, and Helga Absol short, stocky, her black, matte, soul-absorbing armor reflecting not a single gleam, and her gaze from beneath a horned helm was empty, cold, and bottomless as the deepest chasm in her domain. Borin was first to break the oppressive, crushing silence. His voice, coarse and unhewn, rumbled like a subterranean rockslide, shaking the air. Iron Summit calls, speaking of the end of times and of a great, unheard-of alliance. We have come, leaving our hearts undefended, but I see before me no alliance, but a motley gathering. He contemptuously, hatefully jabbed a thick, crooked finger toward the humans and elves, and heard on the road nonsense that Braid Stoneheart, our finest tracker, has become the mouthpiece of some ancient ghost crawled from a crack. Where is he? Let him come forth and prove to us all he has not utterly lost his wits in his endless, lonely wanderings through fell places. A waiting, ringing silence hung in the hall, broken only by the crackle of torches. All gazes, heavy and curious, turned to the deep shadow by the far granite column, from which slowly, with the same inexorability with which dawn comes or a glacier moves, emerged Braid. He said not a single word. He simply stopped and looked directly at Borin. And in that instant the mighty, fearless chieftain of the Thunder Hammers involuntarily took a step back, and his armor clinked. It was not fear of death, but a sudden, all-shattering sensation, as if he were beheld not by a dwarf, not a being of flesh and blood, but the ancient, mute mountain itself given flesh, voice, and piercing gaze. The air around Braid wavered, streamed, and the polished stone floor at his feet silently flowed, forming for a moment a perfectly smooth, mirror-like facet in which, as in a lake, was reflected Borin's stunned, suddenly youth-stricken with terror face. Stone does not lie. Borin, son of Thunder Hammers, Braid's voice sounded. It was a voice in which echoed the low rumble of millennia, the movement of continents, the cooling of magma. It remembers your first, clumsy strike with a war hammer in the Hall of Ancestors, when you were but 10 winters old. It remembers the oath of blood loyalty your great-grandfather, Thrombor Hammerstriker, swore at the very foot of Khazad Gatol's gates, and that same stone now cries out in pain, of the festering one tearing it from within. You came to look upon me, look, but see not me. See the abyss on the very edge of which your whole line, your whole history now stands. Magni's stonecutter, without flinching, met his bottomless gaze. The runes on his face flared slightly brighter, streamed with blue flame, as if testing and trying to measure the counter, incomprehensible flow of ancient power. Words, even if they be truth, are but wind, he uttered coldly, without a single emotion, and his voice sounded like the grinding of diamond on granite. What do you offer us, ghost in warrior's guise? Yet another senseless war, yet another mass grave for our sons that will breed only new enmity. I offer the only path to cleanse the festering wound. Burn it with hot iron before the rot eats the whole body and leaves not even dust. Braid replied evenly and implacably. Khazad Gatol is not a goal, not plunder. It is the first, most necessary step. A step toward becoming one people again, not a pack of starving jackals squabbling over what remains of the great, common heritage. And then, breaking the order, Helga Absol spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, barely audible from beneath the helm, but it scraped the ears and soul like the grinding of confined iron on mica crystals, and made skin crawl. To darkness beneath the earth stirs, she uttered, and her empty, bottomless gaze, as if coming from the very abyss, slid over Braid, not seeing his flesh but sensing the essence. Not the simple darkness goblins and troglodytes bring. Another, ancient as creation itself. It listens now to our talk, and awaits its hour. The one you bear within, spirit of primordial stone, he knows this. You call us to battle a shadow come from the east. But are you certain, Braid not Braid, that fighting beside you, we fight on the light side, and will not sink into another, yet more terrible darkness? Her words, quiet and sharp as a poisoned blade, hung in the air, filling it with sinister, elusive meaning from which a cold shiver ran down the spine. Braid slowly, with the same inexorability with which the planet itself moves, turned his head toward her, and his eyes met the void of her gaze. Light and darkness, as you understand them, do not exist, Helga of the bottomless caverns. His voice sounded, even and indifferent, as a law of nature. There is only order and chaos, balance and decay. I serve order, the framework upon which being rests, and he who waits in the so-called iron maw serves chaos. He serves the end of all, complete and absolute, including that ancient darkness you guard in your caves. His gaze swept over all gathered chieftains, furious, boring, cold, magni, impenetrable Helga, and in his gaze was neither plea nor persuasion, only simple, implacable statement of fact, as if he read text carved on the tablets of fate. You may now turn and return to your clans, to your fortified gorges. You may continue to whet serrated axes against each other, dividing the last ore veins and dried-up beds of underground rivers. And then, when the true darkness, that knows not your clan quarrels, comes to your doors, you will die alone, like expiring beasts in a hole. Your strongholds will fall one by one, your chronicles burn in crimson flame, and your names will forever sink into non-being, with none to remember them. Or you may remember that first and foremost you are children of stone, hewn from one bedrock, and your stone is one, and the threat to it is one. He fell silent, and his silence proved more eloquent than any loud words. And in this ringing, oppressive silence, broken only by the heavy, whistling breath of hundreds of dwarven throats, began the incredible, unthinkable for the recently feuding clans. Bore in deep throat, not taking his grin gaze off Braid, slowly, with a dull, final clang, lowered his huge, dattle-notched wormal onto the polished stone floor, a gesture if not of submission, then of greatest acknowledgement and readiness to listen. The thunder hammers he rasped, and his voice, usually thunderous, now sounded muted. We'll hear what the stone says. Magni's stone-cutter slowly nodded, and the runes on his face, until then burning with tense light, tint, taking on an even, calm, almost placid glow, as if having found an answer. The rune wardens, he pronounced clearly, will inscribe our signs in this new chronicle. Our steel and our enchantments will forge its lines. All gazes, as if on command, turned to Helga Absol. She stood motionless as a statue for a few more agonizing, infinitely long seconds, then simply nodded, once, shortly and sharply, as if cutting off all doubt. The watchers in the dark, her whisper cut the silence, will not idly watch the world's demise from the sidelines. That short declaration sufficed. The great council gather in the stone bowels of Nar-Uzdum-Arak ceased in an instant to be a gathering of feuding clans mired in old grievances. It became the war council of a single, if not yet polished to a shine, dwarven people, and the war for which it gathered was only beginning to unfurl its banners. After the mighty clans, like streams merging into a full-flowing river, came others, less noble but no less proud and stubborn. The stone-cutters arrived from the western, wine-scoured slopes, whose minds were less rich but whose stubbornness and endurance were famed throughout the back. The Firebeards appear, stocky master armorers whose heavy plate was famed across the continent for its unbreakable, battle-tested practicality. The Grey Cliffs came, few in number, but holding ancient, almost forgotten wisdom of forefathers. Their elders with beards long as waterfalls silently listened to the debates and nodded, as if checking what they heard against ancient annals kept not on parchment, but in their own unshakable memory. Each new clan added its own strand to the general, swelling hum of activity. Halls and tunnels of the fortress seemed to expand and delve deeper into the mountain's mass. Under the influx of thousands of tons of steel, thousands of thick beards, and thousands of wills forged into one resolve, the air hummed and vibrated with dozens of guttural tongues and dialects, but gradually, slowly, over old grievances and suspicions, began to emerge a single, powerful rhythm, the rhythm of preparation for the Great March. Only of some clans was there neither word nor rumor, as if they had sunk into oblivion, to secluded those very dwarven ascetics who had long ago gone to the farthest eastern, fell borders, to lands where the dragon's back plunged steeply, meeting the boundless, cold steppes. No tidings were expected from them. None counted on them in battle. They themselves had become legend, myth, a vague mention in old scrolls, guardians of vanished frontiers erased from maps. If they still existed, their personal, quiet battle was already being fought, desperate, unsung, and likely already lost. Against this seething, all-consuming activity, the War Council's final decision sounded like the last, deafening strike of a war hammer on an anvil, casting the sentence in steel. The elder of the Iron Summit, after long and tense consultations with Braid Stoneheart, Dumran, Torbin, and the chieftains of other clans, came forth to those gathered in the packed hall, and his figure seemed the embodiment of the mountain fastness itself. Having heard the will of stone and the sober arguments of reason, his voice, dull and weighty as a subterranean tremor, easily overwrote and absorbed the hum of the thousand-strong throng. The great council decrees, in 10 days and 10 nights, when the silver sickle of the moon hides in the firmament, yielding to impenetrable darkness, we march. Khazad Gatol shall be cleansed of filth, and the dwarven stronghold shall return to its children. By that hour all must be ready. Forges struck for the last time, blades honed to razor sharpness of thought, hearts tempered in the common fire of single will. 10 days. This short span, like a breath before a leap into an abyss, hung over the stone vaults of Nar-Uzdum-Arak heavier than all the leaden strata in its depths. Now every sound, every movement, every breath was subordinated to a single, implacable and loud, as the pulling of subterranean clocks' rhythm of countdown, marking the last moments before the storm. The great forge halls hummed now not like a disturbed hive, but like a single, titanic organism spewing from its blazing depths rivers of steel and concentrated fury. Forges blazed day and night, their infernal flame no longer dying, and its reflections, scarlet and trembling, lay upon the soot-blackened, droplet-splattered faces of masters, on which remained no trace of ordinary human fatigue, only fanatical, almost sacred concentration. The thunder hammers and the firebeards, forgetting their long, bitter competition, now worked shoulder to shoulder, and their heavy hammers beat out not random clangor but a single, mighty battle rhythm to which, it seemed, the whole dragon's back could march to attack. Even the most pragmatic and calculating Copperbeards of Torbin set aside their complex, number-covered blueprints, seizing massive wrenches and hammers, assembling and checking every rivet of the siege engine's monstrous rams, with heads of volcanic glass, mobile shields plated with steel sheets, and folding assault towers whose iron skeletons grew in neighboring lower halls like steel giants born for destruction. Lirael's elves, whose presence had, until recently, drawn wary glances and low whispers, now became an integral, accustomed part of the general preparation. In the spacious archery range stood an almost ringing, tense silence, broken only by the sharp hiss of sliced air and the dull thud of arrows striking targets. But this was no longer simple training, it was deep, concentrated meditation, a rite of purification and tuning. Every archer, be it immortal elf or stocky dwarven crossbowman, invested in each shot not merely physical strength, but all his concentration, all accumulated fury and cold resolve. Iviel and her helpers had set up in a separate cave a veritable field hospital, where dwarven pungent antiseptics smelling of coal and sulfur stood on shelves, beside elven bombs, exuding the delicate aroma of honey, wax, and healing mountain roots. The smell was strange, unfamiliar, yet instilling a peculiar confidence in efficacy. Braid Stoneheart himself appeared rarely in these days, like a ghost. He seemed to hover over all this gigantic, seething preparation, not interfering with the commander's directives, yet his unseen presence was felt everywhere. Like the pressure of mountain strata, when in one of the far armories an unstable rock mass unexpectedly collapsed, threatening to crush a dozen armors, the polished stone floor at their feet heaved of itself, forming an instant and sturdy protective barrier. No one saw how it happened, heard no incantation, but all understood without words. The mountain, their mother and bastion, was with them, and its will spoke through Braid's mouth. And the last night arrived, the longest and quietest of all 10 days. The all-consuming nose of work fell silent, anvils and hammers stilled. All preparations were complete, all mechanisms checked. In the vast, drafty halls thousands of warriors laid down on stone floors, trying to sleep. But sleep, heavy and restless, came to none. Dwarves sat in small groups by extinguished but still warm forges, polishing already flawless weapons to mirror blinding sheen, and their beards stirred in time to the low muttering of ancient war songs. Elves meditated in silence, legs crossed, their beautiful and detached faces in the half-light, lit only by the gleam of glowing mosses, like pale, frozen ivory masks. Humans and centaurs, gathering separately, checked harnesses for the last time, tightened armor straps, and stared at one point in the void, mentally already there. Beyond the fortress' mighty walls, in the smoky, death-reeking halls of Khazad Gatol, Lirael this night, like a true leader, silently walked the sleeping or only pretending to sleep camp. She walked slowly, her light steps making no sound on polished stone, past rows of dwarves whose gray, braided beards lay on steel breastplates like tangled manes. past humans clutching amulets and medallions, past centaurs whose mighty, scarred flanks rose evenly in time to heavy, cavewine-like breathing. She stopped at the very entrance to the main hall, leaning a hand on the cold granite of the Jan, and looking at the titanic, rune-adorned and massive barred gates leading north, to their common fate. Beyond them, beyond that solid barrier, lay the winding road that must lead them either to glory or to doom. Tomorrow, with the first ray of dawn that never penetrated these halls, the air around was thick, motionless, and heavy, smelling of cooled metal, sweat-soaked leather, and mute, unspoken prayer directed at the stone vaults. 10 days had passed, the last sand fallen in the hourglass. The time had come to pay all debts presented by fate. At dawn, when the last, most stubborn night shadow still clung to the vault's jagged arches, the elders and supreme commanders gathered for a last, brief council at the black basalt table. The air was cold, sharp, and prickly as the edge of a freshly honed dagger. And it was then, in that pre-dawn silence, that the decision long and secretly maturing in the minds of those who retained a grain of sober calculation amidst the universal fury and thirst for battle was spoken aloud. The young and those unfit for battle remained here. The elder of the Iron Summit's voice sounded firm and irrefutable as a smith's hammer blow. Finn, Alaric, Elodi, Torian, you have no place in this siege meat grinder. The goblins of Khazad Gatol are treacherous and cruel. Their poisons spare none. The silence that followed these words was deafening, thick as tar. Torian's pale, twisted with outrage and anger face, his fists clenched in impotent fury. Elodi's empty yet unbearably piercing gaze fixed on nothing. Each endured this harsh sentence, in their own way, but equally painfully. Even Finn, whose young soul seemed utterly burned out, slowly raised his extinguished, dead gaze to the elder, and in its depths for a moment, like an ember in ash, flashed and died a shadow of former, unspoken pain. You will remain here, under the protection of these walls, and await our return. The elder continued, and in his usually firm as granite voice sounded for the first time not only iron will, but heavy, fatherly, infinitely weary sorrow, the sorrow of those who perhaps bid farewell forever. And then, as if the very earth, unable to bear the injustice, rushed to take their place, 3 stepped forward, through the crowd, 3 in whose eyes burned not reflected but their own inner fire capable of melting steel and incinerating falsehood. In their silent step was such power that even the grim dwarven elders for a moment stepped back, yielding way to this living wall of pain and wrath. We will go in the front ranks, a grim's voice thundered, and his titanic figure, seared by the fire of burned homes and scarred like a map of his losses, seemed the very embodiment of vengeance given flesh. He gripped his massive smith's hammer as if it were the only anchor in a crumbling world, the last hold in a raging sea of grief, for the clearing, for far bank, for all whose voices were forever silenced in smoke and screams. Beside him, as if rooted in stone, stood guard, gnarled and unbreakable as an old storm-seen oak. In his weathered, rough as hewn granite features was read not mere blind fury, but cold, methodical, and merciless resolve of a woodsman come to cut down a blighted forest to the very root, leaving no sprout. My place is in the thick, in the foremost ranks, he rasped, without hesitation, so that not one foul creature seeps into the rear. To those left behind and to whom we vowed to return, and to them, a silent shadow, joined Mercil, the lean Khajiit with slit eyes burning yellow fire, and a face etched with ritual scar-script exuded a quiet, almost ringing in the air hatred, sharp as a honed blade. My people, the desert wind, was wiped from the face of the earth. His voice was like the dry, death-rattle hiss of a venomous serpent. Of them remains no campfire songs, no names for remembrance, no graves for mourning, but their pain, their last cry, remain in me, and I shall bear it, like a torch, into the very heart of the enemy's stronghold. That shall be my last testament, my personal contribution to the common cause. In their silent, yet thunderous resolve was no youthful recklessness or thirst for glory. There was terrible, endured to the dregs, crystal pure certainty. They believed, not merely blindly hoped, but knew in their gut that every stone wrested from the enemy in Khazad Gatol would be not a victory in a foreign, distant war, but a personal, shattering blow against the one who had taken all they loved. This was the first, necessary, blood-etched step, a foothold in the coming battle, the beginning of the long, dark path to retribution, the end of which they themselves might not see. And then, as if by an unseen signal, the river surged forth. No, not a river, the very living stone itself moved, clanging with steel, breathing overheated forgere and unshakable resolve. Tens of thousands of dwarves in mirror-polished armor, with heavy axes and halberds on shoulders, began to exit the fortress in a steady, unhurried, almost ritual formation. There was no feverish haste, no hysterical battle cries, only the heavy, measured, crushing hum of thousands of souls on stone, the dull clang of steel on steel, beating a march for those who awaited them in the halls of Khazad Gatol, a march sounding to them a death knell. In the foremost ranks, as they had sworn, went those very three, a grim with his titanic, notched hammer, his face beneath the lowered visor, like a granite mask of fury and grief, Gar, gnarled and unbreakable, his famed axe resting on his shoulder. His gaze fixed forward into the tunnel's darkness was intent, cold, and merciless. And Mercil, whose lean, supple figure seemed a shadow beside them, but in his golden, wildcat eyes burned a fire capable of incinerating not only strongholds, but the very memory of them. Behind them, shoulder to shoulder, having for a time forgotten old strife, marched the great clans, thunder hammers with their famed, wall-shattering mauls, rune wardens, whose armor and weapons glowed faintly in the tunnel's half-light with mysterious, shifting sigils holding ancient might. And beside the dense dwarven phalanxes, strange and beautiful contrast, moved other figures unaccustomed to the underworld. Lirael's elves glided soundlessly, their longbows ready, strings taut, faces beneath hoods holding the icy, detached calm of eternity. Daryl's rangers moved in a tight, mobile combat group, their mixed human and elven blood giving them a special, predatory grace and speed. And trained gazes accustomed to reading tracks and ambushes sought the slightest unseen threats. In the dark, and Vronder's centaurs, their powerful, steel-shod hooves beating a special, quiet but bone-felt rhythm, and the long, composite bows in their strong hands seemed toy-like. But every soul in the column knew their arrows knew no miss and would pierce even the thickest armor. It was a sight the likes of which the world had not seen since the legendary Great Alliance. Sung in songs and nearly forgotten, children of stone, forest, and boundless steppe, different as sky and earth, divided by age-old enmity, distrust, and different gods. But now, in the wavering torchlight, one will forge into a steel blade of necessity led them. One common calamity that had swept away all barriers. And over all this sea of steel, slightly apart, not heading the column, but being its unseen spiritual and physical center, walked heavily and inexorably Braid Stoneheart. He did not look around, did not hearten warriors. His bottomless gaze was fixed only forward, northward, into the thickest darkness, where in the mountains under halls lay their goal and their eternal curse. From him emanated the same unchanging, crushing power, but now in it was felt dynamism, terrible directed force. It seemed the very mountain, standing in place for centuries, had at last shifted from its foundation to march upon another, desecrated mountain. They marched north, into the very heart of darkness, to Khazad Gatol, to the dwarven cradle, defiled, spat upon, and turned into a den, to the first line of defense in a war that for the world was only beginning, but for them had long been underway. They marched not merely to reclaim it, they marched to burn with hot iron the festering one upon their people's body, before the poison spread through all veins and killed all living. They marched to take this first, bloody step in the long, merciless war against the true, bottomless darkness. And they knew, with soul-piercing certainty, that many of those now exiting the great gates of Nar-Uzdum-Arak would never see them again, never cross back that threshold. Thank you for your attention. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next part and chapter.